Today we're going to make a video that will have helpful information for pretty much just advanced learners of Spanish. If we're being completely honest, if you're just starting out and trying to learn Spanish, this information will probably be a little overwhelming. I don't know how much I can recommend really paying too much attention to the information in this video if you're just starting out, but of course, sometimes for some people, jumping ahead and hearing some information ahead of time can be helpful. But honestly, this information is probably just for you if you're an advanced learner of Spanish. We're going to be talking about attaching infinitive verbs to different grammatical components or elements. So let's get right into it. Attaching infinitive verbs to different grammatical components. We could just start out with the most basic way this is done to help us have an idea of what we're even talking about. So, with words such as querer, esperar, necesitar, maybe something like preferir, deber, poder. So these are some basic verbs that generally have an infinitive verb attached to them. What do I mean by that? Something like quiero comer, esperas hablar, debemos cocinar. So here we have I want to eat, you hope to speak, and we should cook. What's happening here? Well, we are attaching infinitive verbs. Comer, hablar, cocinar. Obviously, an infinitive verb in Spanish is a verb that ends in AR, ER, or IR in its base form. And so we see comer, that's an infinitive verb, and we're attaching it to quiero. Hablar is an infinitive verb, and we're attaching it to esperas, and cocinar is an infinitive verb, and we're attaching it to debemos. So here we're attaching it to one of these verbs that generally has an infinitive verb attached to it. When we're teaching someone, a new learner Spanish, we say first verb conjugated, second verb infinitive. This is something for you as an advanced learner. You probably learned this a while ago. But the idea here is these words, querer, esperar, necesitar, preferir, deber, poder, these are verbs that sort of beg to have an infinitive verb attached to them. On their own, they're not very actiony. Want, hope, need, prefer, should, can. They are verbs, but sometimes it's even hard to recognize when you're really thinking about it right away that it's definitely a verb. It's not very actiony, but they are verbs. And they sort of beg to have something attached to it. And with these verbs that normally have an infinitive verb attached to them, we have that rule first verb conjugated, second verb infinitive, and there's nothing in between. There's quiero, then there's comer. There's esperas and hablar, debemos and cocinar. There's nothing in between the two verbs, the two grammatical components. So on top here, I'm going to put nothing. Because basically, we're going to start talking about now how sometimes it isn't just nothing, there is something that's placed between the two grammatical components, the second one being an infinitive verb. For instance, sometimes you'll see an placed between the two grammatical components. and a. Some examples could be voy a comer. And another example could be aprendemos a hablar. Aprendemos a hablar. Maybe something like español. Aprendemos a hablar español. We learn to speak Spanish. Maybe something like queremos llegar a conocerte. Queremos llegar a conocerte. Maybe something like vine a hablarte. Another thing could be te animo a hablarle. Maybe something like te voy a enseñar a hablar español. And maybe one more. Ella quiere ayudarme a cocinar. Ella quiere ayudarme a cocinar. So, what's going on here? Well, voy a comer. Comer is an infinitive verb, and we're attaching it to another verb, voy. Aprendemos a hablar español. Hablar is an infinitive verb, and we're attaching it to another verb, aprendemos. Queremos llegar a conocerte. Well, there we have conocer. Conocer is an infinitive verb, and we're attaching it to llegar there, another verb. And hablarte, vine a hablarte. Hablar, we're attaching it to a verb, and so on. You can see the infinitive verbs we are attaching to verbs just like in the first section, but the difference here is we're adding an a in between the two grammatical components. And so that is what's interesting. The way I like to describe it here is we are talking about motion ideas, whether it's a figurative motion or a physical motion, whether it's a figurative motion or a physical motion. For example, vine a hablarte. I came to talk to you. There's sort of a physical motion there, right? I literally came here to this place to talk to you, right? A physical motion. And even with voy a comer, voy a is normally associated with a physical motion like voy a la tienda. Physical, those are kind of physical motion words to go, to come, right? Even though voy a comer, the idea I'm going to eat, it's not so physical, kind of maybe getting into the figurative idea of what we're talking about. But aprendemos a hablar español. Now we're going to start thinking about it more as a figurative motion. We learn to speak Spanish. The idea there is we are moving from one or the lack of of an ability to having another ability. We're sort of progressing, kind of like a motion, a figurative motion, achieving that end goal of being able to speak Spanish. We want to get to know you. Queremos llegar a conocerte. We want to llegar. That's another one of those physical motion words. But here it's kind of like we want to arrive to the point of knowing you. We want to reach that destination, sort of a figurative motion idea there. We want to get to know you. Te animo a hablarle. I encourage you to speak to him. I encourage you to get to the point of being able to speak to him or reaching that end goal, sort of a figurative motion. Te voy a enseñar a hablar español. I'm going to teach you to speak Spanish. I'm going to teach you to be able to progress to this idea or this goal, better said, of teaching, of speaking Spanish, being able to speak Spanish. And then finally, ella quiere ayudarme a cocinar. She wants to help me to cook. She wants to help me to get to my end goal of cooking. Some of these things, whether or not it's a bit of a stretch, we're doing the best we can to sort of make sense of why we are attaching infinitive verbs to different grammatical components. And sometimes, for instance, in the first column here, we're not putting anything in between the two grammatical components, but here we're putting the a. In the first column, they are verbs that beg for something to be attached to it. The quiero, the esperas, debemos, and then the infinitive verb is attached to these verbs that beg for it, that aren't so actiony by themselves, and we don't put anything in between. Just first verb conjugated, second verb infinitive. Here we're in the second column, and it's more of a figurative or physical motion arriving to some goal, so to speak, and we put an a in between the two grammatical components. We'll start another column here, and this will be the de column. De. This could be something like, estoy feliz de conocerte. Maybe something like, trato de limpiar la casa todos los días. Acabo de comer. Voy a terminar. Voy a dejar de comer helado. Voy a dejar de comer helado. And maybe something like, él es difícil de agradar. So with this de section, I don't really recommend trying to think of some sort of guiding principle or rule that really explains what's going on here as much. It would be better to just kind of memorize individual ideas. Sometimes Spanish gets to that point. But what's going on here? Estoy feliz de conocerte. We have our infinitive verb there, conocer. But now we're attaching it to feliz, which is an adjective. So that could be something new to think about. It's the first time we're attaching an infinitive verb to an adjective. And the same thing down here, él es difícil de agradar. We have our infinitive verb, agradar. He is hard to please. And we're attaching agradar to difícil, which is also an adjective. So that could be something to keep in mind, right? When we're attaching an infinitive verb to an adjective. It's the first time we're doing it here in this video, these two times, that we're going to put a de in between the two grammatical components, the adjective and the infinitive verb. Once again, we're not really trying to, it's not recommended to try to delve too deeply into the idea of why. It's already hard enough. We have enough to remember. And so we're going to try to just have this idea in mind, attaching an infinitive verb to an adjective. We're probably going to go ahead and put the de in between the two grammatical components, the adjective and the verb. Now we have trato de limpiar la casa todos los días. I try to clean the house every day. We have acabo de comer, which has the idea of I just finished eating. I just finished eating. And then we have voy a dejar de comer helado. I'm going to stop eating ice cream. And so we have limpiar is an infinitive verb. We're attaching it to a verb. Trato there, tratar. And comer, an infinitive verb. We're attaching it to acabo. Comer also in that other sense. We're attaching it to dejar. I'm going to stop eating ice cream. It's just recommended to honestly just memorize some of these ideas. That with tratar, and we're trying to do something, and we're starting with tratar, and we're going to have an infinitive verb after that. We're going to put a de in between those two. I just got done doing something. It's usually best to just remember with acabar, and you're attaching an infinitive verb to it. You're going to put a de in between those two verbs, and to stop doing something is dejar de, an infinitive verb, and you're going to put a de in between those verbs. Not really recommended to try to think of some guiding principle as to why. I mean, we do see these words like dejar, to stop, kind of. Dejar actually usually has other meanings, but in this case, to stop, acabar, to kind of finish eating. I just got done eating, or just finished eating, to finish. Tratar, to try, in this instance, to try. Those words, try, finish, stop, to me, they're a little more actiony, a little more easily recognizable as verbs in comparison to want, hope, need, that first column. But once again, not really recommended to try to get some all guiding principle here. We're just trying to remember with this de column that you have these specific words, tratar, acabar, dejar, that when you attach an infinitive verb to them, we're going to put a de in between them. And also attaching an infinitive verb to an adjective, we're going to put a de. Let's go ahead and do another column. Para. This is kind of like the para slash por column. No vivo para trabajar. Maybe trabajo para vivir. And then we could do something like esfuerzo por aprender español. And maybe siempre se preocupa por, siempre se preocupa por ganar dinero. Siempre se preocupa por ganar dinero. Let's analyze these ideas here. No vivo para trabajar. I don't live to work. So the idea to think about here with the para, and we're attaching trabajar, an infinitive verb, to another verb, vivo. We'll just say straight off the bat here that these verbs are definitely, to me, more actiony in comparison to that first column, like vivir. I don't live to work, the first one. I don't live. It's a little weird, but like on its own, I live, you live, he lives. It kind of can exist a little more on its own in comparison to those words in the first column. I hope, I need, I prefer, I should. They're really begging to have something attached to it. But these words here in this para por column, they're a little more substantial on their own. That's something to keep in mind. But the main thing here with para is we want to think of the phrase in order, in order, in order. I don't live, no vivo para trabajar. I don't live to work. I don't live in order to work. You could kind of say that idea if even if you're not saying the in order, but you could kind of say it. That would be a trigger that we would use para. No vivo para trabajar. So we're attaching an infinitive verb to a verb, but we have to put something in between, and it's the para. And the idea in English is that if you can kind of make that in order work, sounds pretty okay, then we'll probably do it. Trabajo para vivir. I work in order to live, or I work to live. Even if we're saying I work to live, you could say in order. So we're putting the para. Now we're getting into por, me esfuerzo por aprender español. I exert myself to learn Spanish. I exert myself to learn Spanish. A little weird in English there. Maybe there's a more normal way of saying that in English. But the idea here is whenever we want to say esforzarse, to exert oneself, and we attach an infinitive verb to that verb, generally we're going to put por in between the two grammatical components. And it's usually best to just memorize that specific one. Ironically enough, it is possible to say me esfuerzo para aprender español. I exert myself in order to learn Spanish. That kind of makes sense, right? You can do that. You can do para. I think por is a little more normal. And it's best to kind of just remember you can do both, and por is the more normal one. To try to get into the reason why, that's the difference between por and para, which is hard enough on its own, let alone trying to apply it here. But just briefly, the idea, me esfuerzo para aprender español. Para usually indicates that that thing after the para is the destination, comes after the thing before the para, the destination. And so the idea there is I'm exerting myself para to kind of arrive or get to that end destination, that end goal of learning Spanish, which obviously comes after my exerting myself. But por technically is more like the thing after por isn't the destination, but the motivation. It existed before the thing before the por. So the idea here is I exert myself because of my motivation to learn Spanish. It's a little weird, a little hard to understand, but in the future, we'll talk more about por and para. And in all, just to normal people, none of this really matters. That's why I recommended to just remember that with esforzarse, it's normal to use por. Probably a little less normal to use para, but they're both okay. And you definitely can't just attach the infinitive verb to esforzarse without putting anything in between. It's one of these ones that falls in this section. where you have to put the por or the para in between the two grammatical components. Siempre se preocupa por ganar dinero. He's always worried about earning money. He's always worried about earning money. Just another thing where it's much better to just remember that with preocuparse, por is the way to go. When you're attaching an infinitive verb to it, por is what is done. We put a por in between those two grammatical components. And finally, I'm going to just mention something else. A que column, Q-U-E, que. You're probably already familiar with tengo que comer. Maybe you're not familiar with, or maybe you are. Hay que comer. Maybe something like tengo cosas que hacer. So I recommend with the que to just kind of remember when you're dealing with tener or haber. I comes from haber, these ideas. Have, haber is a certain kind of have. Tener is a certain kind of have. We put a que when we're attaching an infinitive verb to these ideas. The idea that you generally want to have in mind is that we have to put a que, and not really, I wouldn't recommend trying to get into why. But we have comer, it's an infinitive verb. We're attaching it to another verb, tener. You have to remember that you have to put a que in between the two grammatical components. Hay que comer, that's the same idea that we have to eat, but it's not specifying who has to eat. It's just generally known that that is what has to be done. We have to eat, and you're attaching comer to haber and a verb, and we're going to remember that when we do that, we have to put the que. And this last one's a little interesting, right? Tengo cosas que hacer. I have things to do. Well, here we have our infinitive verb hacer, but here we're actually attaching it. This is our first time in this video to a noun. Cosas. You're attaching it to a noun. Generally, you'll see that with this kind of idea of tener or haber before the noun. I or tengo or some conjugation of tener. Then you have your noun, and when you're attaching the infinitive verb to that noun in this situation, we're going to put a que. So there you have it, a video with hopefully helpful information about attaching infinitive verbs to different grammatical components.